You know what Reformed evangelical Christian doesn't like Lord of the Rings? Same thing. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah. You like Lord of the Rings too, right?
I have watched none of them.
we're fighting.
Hi, James.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, like 30 minutes.
James, since the last time we sat here, there's somebody
We
else
changed chairs.
who's entered. Brittany, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow.
We're very excited
Such
to
a
have
warm
you here.
welcome. Yeah, excited to be here.
Before we start, I didn't prep you on this because I thought it would be more fun to just get your honest reaction. How's your first couple of weeks been? How are things going so far?
Yeah, it's been so good. We've
Yeah.
been, thrown into the deep end a little bit. Like
Yeah.
there's lots to do. But it's been really exciting. Really really awesome. I as all my friends have been asking me, like, how's the new job? I'm like, there have been kids that have started to come find us on Sunday mornings. And so I think that's been like the really cool part is like relationships have already started to build, which is awesome.
That's awesome. That's good. What are you looking forward to over the next couple of months?
Yeah, I'm just excited to like talk to more people, to get to know people more, like especially our leader team, our volunteer team, and all of our kids and our youth. Like I'm just excited to get to know them more and build some deeper relationships.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I can attest to people coming to find you. I had a small tiff with one of our senior highs this week because said senior high comes to my office every Sunday morning and says hello, and daps me up, and we say a few words. And that person just totally bypassed my office this week and went right into hers and sat there for like a half an hour. And so I told them that we were fighting. So you're already coming between me and the youth. So that's good. You're doing your.
Oh, that's
I'm
good.
kidding.
Good.
No, it's awesome. We've been so happy to have you around. It's been great to be getting to know you, and it's been a lot of fun. So thanks for being here.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for jumping into the conversation today.
Oh yeah, excited.
It
Excited
helps
for
us
it.
when we get to bounce ideas off people. Well, we're in the middle of this series where we're looking at 5 theological perspectives or worldviews, and the first 2 weeks are the ones that we're going to cover here. We'll try to be as succinct as possible. In the first week, we talked about Worldview 1, this concept of separation and reunion, the idea that we're feeling like an orphan, we're feeling like we are longing. James, of all of this, you came up with the big question that I think most people in this worldview are asking, and that is,
Where do I belong?
where do I belong? And that's a tough question that I think a lot of people wonder. And whether you're a Christian or not, I think a lot of people are trying to figure out where they fit and how that looks. I'm wondering from your perspective a little bit how you think maybe this has changed generationally. I'm wondering how much social media has actually influenced the under 25s on where they fit and where they belong versus those of us that grew up in a world that was a little bit more analog, but now we're seeing it. I think it's easier for us to ignore social media when we want to, but maybe not as much for you guys. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think like it's interesting, like that question of like, where do I belong? I think it's always like hypersensitive in that like youth age. I think like throughout generations, like those in high school, like even, if you like watch movies from the 90s of like everyone has their like group and there's the jocks and wherever, but it's like, oh, that there's always that one person that's like, oh, I don't know where I belong. I don't know what table to sit at. And I think like today it's the same, but it's just like amplified with social media, and it's like, oh, my whole life is now in a fishbowl. I just can't like find my crew and stick with them. It's like everybody can be aware of my life, and I can be aware of everybody else's life, and mine doesn't look like theirs, or I don't have the same clothes that they have, or whatever that may be. And so that feeling of insignificance, that feeling of like, I actually don't fit in with these people, I don't actually have a place where I feel like I belong, because my life doesn't look like all of their other lives, which is, all of their lives are not perfect, but it's just the snapshot that we see, and that we think is like the ultimate truth. And so I think like for youth today, it's a little bit more amplified, and I think they probably all struggle to an extent of like, I don't feel like I fit here because my life doesn't look like other people's lives look.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nail. There's an element of age where this is the age where you're sort of asking the question, where do I belong? And it's much more central to who you are as a person, navigating the world and the community and school and friend groups. And so that question is very close to home. And I like, the idea that you brought up about social media. I think a real issue that we can address too is the pandemic, the social isolation that our youth experienced just in the last 3 years, which I think amplified this fishbowl that you called it of social media, because that was their only way of connecting with other people, but it really limited or stunted their ability to find their place when they're in an actual group of people, right? And I think the question of where do we belong for people who aren't in that stage of life then becomes much more existential. What's my place in the world? What's my place in history? The older you get, the more you think about, what am I leaving behind? Where do we belong? It's just, I think it's a core struggle that we all deal with, but our youth especially. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I can make assumptions about your upbringing because we're close enough in age, and I'm going to just tell a short little bit, and then I want to know how it contrasts to you or the people that are in your age bracket or close to your age bracket. Because as we've learned, we've got 15 or 20 years on you, which makes us feel blessed to have the younger perspective, but old. When I grew up without the entire world in my pocket, I was one of those kids in high school that didn't fit. I didn't have a group. I had a small friend group that my cousin was a part of that I sort of infiltrated. If not, I probably would have sat alone most of the time. And I didn't have a ton of friends, and that wasn't the fit. But then I would leave school and I would go home. And like that seemed to be the place where I belonged, or I had a couple of friends and that seemed to be my spot. But the place that I felt like I didn't belong never followed me around. And I'm wondering if like there's a part of you, either you personally or people in your orbit that you've seen where even generationally, this question has been complicated by the fact that it was easier for me to answer that question because I could go, yeah, that's not my spot. And I could walk away from it and it stayed there. But now it seems like the places that you do belong and the places that you don't all follow you around. Is like, am I close? Is there a contrast in my, like, sort of the way I experience this to the way maybe your generation has?
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate, right? It's like, okay, we don't, like when we're feeling down or feeling like, what do? We pull out our phones and what do we see? We see everyone hanging out without us, or we see this group chat that we're not a part of, or whatever it may be, right? And so I think there's like always that constant reminder of like, oh, I'm not included in that, or I don't feel like I fit, or, I have to go back into this place. And I've been hearing from like a lot of parents too of like, and even students of like, oh yeah, I don't want to come back to youth group after the pandemic because I don't really know anyone, or like I knew them, but I don't really like have a connection with them. And I think like this worldwide like shutdown kind of had us all isolated. And it's just that much harder to step back into community. And a community that is like safe and welcoming and inclusive seems so foreign. And so like thinking that we can actually find that place at church seems like an unrealistic thing, which is really heartbreaking, actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how all of this affects people who have or have a tendency toward this worldview, to hear the gospel message, to have almost experienced this isolation, or as you talked about, even with the pandemic, this sort of forced isolation away from everybody, to now come back out and go, how do I can I even find out where I belong? Or maybe the pandemic shook people's ability to do that. And now they're coming out. We're trying to share the gospel with people and tell them that they have this grand kingdom that they're welcomed into and belong in, but they can't even see themselves belonging anywhere.
Yeah, the thought that comes to my mind is that the church is the place where we should experience that belonging. And so, how do we communicate that to a world that is sort of, not sure, trepidatious about stepping out, putting themselves out there in any context, let alone the extra pressure of, I'm going to walk into a church community and there's that whole faith component. And, I think there's a challenge to be overcome there. And I think we can only really overcome it by, again, it's this idea of living by example. This idea of belonging, we belong to God's family. Well, the expression of God's family that he left for us is the church. And if we're doing church well, it should be appealing to people to come and be a part of that community, because it does create that sense of belonging and that sense of, this is somewhere where I'm welcomed. And so learning to do that well, I think the church has something to offer that the rest of culture doesn't right now. And so we really need to lean into that and figure out how we communicate it well. But what's the right answer? I think we're still feeling that out.
Mm-hmm. That's a fun conversation. How do we, if we're working with somebody or know somebody or are somebody who's a bit more of a world one, that, as you make a point, I think is a reasonable one. If we're looking at what it looks like to be a part of or belong in God's family, as good of a representation we have on earth as that should be here, what do we need to do as a church to model and show people that they actually belong here? What does that look like for you in your context? So, like, I was on the youth side for a long time, but just by nature now I am forced to think more from the adult side, which is probably good for everybody that's under 20 anyway. But like, how do you do that? Because you belong, and especially if we're trying to get this point across that you don't just belong here, but you belong in God's family, has a lot more to do with, than how much pizza you're giving out or how much Mountain Dew you're getting these kids on or running around with Nerf guns. It's how do you develop that space where kids actually know, whether it's kids or youth, my kindergartner or a kid in grade 10, how do you develop spaces where they feel like this is actually what it looks like to be a part of God's family?
Yeah, that's actually something we had our first youth leaders meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about that. It's just we have to be so aware of these kids that are maybe on the outside. We have a lot of kids in our youth that go to the same school, and so it's really easy for them to click together. And then there's the few that are outside of that, and I would probably argue that those inside the clique probably are don't feel like they have a great sense of belonging either, and they're hanging on to those people for security purposes. But I think just being hypersensitive and hyper aware of okay, we have to be always looking for the one that seems like they're a little bit uncomfortable, they're a little bit lost, they don't quite fit in, and then being just uber intentional about connecting with that child, whether that's on a Sunday morning or whether that's at youth group or wherever. It's we have to always just live through this filter of okay, it may be uncomfortable even for us as leaders to what do I have to say to a teenager? And maybe somebody is listening to this and you're like someone older within our congregation and you're like, well, I don't have any business talking to teenagers. But I think there's a lot of value in just seeking out those people who may be sitting alone or maybe like just in their little small group on a Sunday, and you like just going and connecting with them and being really intentional about those conversations. I think is so essential. It seems so simple, but I think like that is the way that we do it. And like we've started doing small groups at youth, and it's like, okay, this is a little uncomfortable. Like we're putting our phones away and we're talking about what we've learned. We're talking about how our week was and what was hard about it and what was like life-giving about it. And it's not natural for these kids. And it's like, there are some awkward moments, but it's actually really beautiful when they start to open up and like begin to realize that this is like a place where we can bring these things. And that's what like youth group here at IPC was for me as a youth. Like it was like, this was my safe place. This was the place where I could come and just bring all of my junk happening at home or school or wherever. And so that's just really my like heartbeat. And I think the Lord's heartbeat for these kids is just to like have this be a safe and welcoming and inclusive space.
Yeah, I think we see that in small groups, as well, right? Like sitting in men's ministry meetings and just knowing that that's the space where, guys will open up about the stuff that's really on their hearts that they might not do otherwise. And yeah, just the value of creating those safe spaces. Yeah, really cool.
Belonging in a big part, and you've touched about this, and so did you. And I think when we read through scripture, we see this. Belonging requires a lot of intentionality. You really have to, and a lot of times you have to try either yourself to find a spot or you need to find somebody else a spot. And our church is in a period of its development, growth, whatever you want to say, where we are going to have to start to be really intentional about this, if not soon, then now. I think we've all noticed that there's a few more people here per week than there used to be. And if you've noticed that it's true over the course of the last few months, I think our average attendance has been up, 50 or so people on a week or a little more. And that's not us going, hey, look, whatever. That's going, okay, if part of being a leader is defining reality, here's the reality. Every week, there's a whole bunch of people walking through our doors going, do I belong here? And sometimes for those of us that have been around for a while, that it can be overwhelming to step outside of ourselves every week and see and talk to somebody new. But the reality is if nobody talks to those people throughout a day or a couple of visits, the answer to their question is going to be, I don't belong here. Maybe I belong somewhere else. And that's a really tough development spot for every church. When you've got it's exactly what you were talking about for those high school students, except it's happening here. It's all of these guys and girls are already connected here, but now there's other people coming in, and what they need to do is they need to open the circle. And then when those people enter the circle, they need to stop just talking to themselves, right? And like, not everybody needs to talk to the new person, but somebody has to. And I think that can be just as good of a witness as anything, as to, Jesus stopped and talked to a lot of people that other people wouldn't have stopped to talk to. And Jesus showed belonging not just by the things that he taught, but by actually the way he treated people. So as our pastor of care and discipleship, what should or could people be thinking about, whether it's on a Sunday morning or in the middle of a week, knowing that we are in this reality right now where we are in a stage where we have an opportunity to express what belonging looks like to new people who are walking through the door every day?
Yeah. I think it's two pieces at least come to mind. One is it actually comes from a video that as a staff we watched, I think 2 weeks ago. And it's this idea that we were all misfits at one point in time, coming into the building. Each of us came here from somewhere. Either we came from another church, or or we even if we were born into the church, we were still a new person coming in. But chances are most people have moved at some point in their life and have come and joined a new community. So I think it's a common experience, but we all didn't fit at one point, and somebody made us feel comfortable. Someone came along before us and helped us fit, helped us find belonging. And I think it's important to remember that once you have that sense of belonging, you do sort of have a responsibility to do that for others, to create that space where they can feel at home too. And I think it takes a little bit of self-reflection to say, yeah, I once was lost, but now I'm found, right? And to do that for someone else. I think the biggest burden or struggle that people have is they don't know what to say. They don't know how to, especially if you didn't do it the first week, and then you didn't do it the second week, and now that person's been here for a little while, and now it's even more awkward if I go up and talk to them because I should probably know who they are by now. And what do you say? I found one of the simplest things is to walk up to someone and just say, "Hi, I don't think I've met you yet," and just start a conversation. And that conversation can lead into, details about that person's life. Just, put a couple of those in the back of your head. And then a week or two later, say hello again and ask them about the things that they told you. That communicates so much about, 1, they were heard, 2, you cared enough to remember, and 3, you value that information enough to ask about it again, follow up with them. Those are huge. So anyway.
That's awesome. Oh, that's so good. And I think as we talk about through this series of okay, there's different people with different worldviews. I think it's important with this one to remember that we all have a need. We were created for community. And so no matter where we are, oh, I don't think that person, maybe values it as much or whatever we can, think, or they have somebody, and it's no, community is so essential. It's what we were created for. We're created to be a part of the church. And so I think it's just so important. It's okay, well, put aside your own, thoughts and insecurities, because there's going to be things that you're going to be well, I shouldn't, or, they have somebody else or whatever that may be. And just consciously put it aside and say no, they were built for community, and I'm a part of this community, and I was also built for community and relationship. And so let's just connect, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, but just knowing their name, knowing a little bit of their story, I think helps you both feel like you have a place to belong here, because you know one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say during this season, do that. Go up to people, introduce yourself in that way or whatever makes you feel comfortable. Inevitably, what's going to happen, and this is the one thing that keeps people from doing this, and if we all just decide that it's okay, then it will be okay. And that's this. If you are afraid of you introducing yourself to somebody for what you think is the first time, but in fact it is not, or you say to somebody, "Hey, are you new here?" and they go, "Actually, I've been here for 6 years."
Don't ask that question.
We can all just be that's fine. Right? The only thing that would actually upset you about that is arrogance or pride. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Right? Well, no, I've been here for 7 years, and that's stop, get rid of that. It doesn't matter, right? And neither does the other thing. If somebody's genuinely trying to reach out and make a connection or see whether or not you belong, that's actually the part that we need to see. Yeah. And we need to give people the grace for the fact that maybe they met 6 people the same week that they met you, and you were the one that slipped out of the brain while their kid was throwing a Fruit Loop at them on the way home. We all have our different contexts and experiences, but as long as we continue to be a church that tries, I think that we're going to be able to model this fairly well. Well, that's the first one. The second week, we talked about this concept of conflict and vindication, the idea that sometimes people just see things and it gets them very upset. And they feel either oppressed themselves or like other people are. And to them, Jesus is the liberator or the Messiah. And I brought up this one concept during the message, and I was trying to dip my toes in the water of things that would make people feel uncomfortable without making it distracting. And I had 2 pieces of feedback that made me feel like it worked. The first person came up to me and said, I noticed that you mentioned feminism there for a minute. I wish you had expanded more on that. And the second person came up to me and said, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I freaked out and I tried to crawl into a hole. And I was like, yep. That's the spectrum of what we're dealing with. Why do you think certain groups of Christians struggle so much with this idea of injustice or social justice? And maybe especially, but not necessarily especially, in our current time and culture. Either of you, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, well, I think that like social justice, like even that term is like hyper political. People like just have ideas of what that means. And I think that like the world, like there is like, I think there's 2 different types of justice, like just from my perspective. There's like a God-centered approach to justice, and then there is a man-centered approach to justice. And so when we don't know the line or the difference between the 2, like I think our automatic, association with social justice is like the government and, all of these other things that are like maybe a more liberal way of thinking that, certain movements and things like that don't actually align with what the Bible says. And so as soon as we hear social justice, we have our backs up and we're, get a little bit offended perhaps. But I think if we go back to what the Bible says about justice, like it says in Deuteronomy 32, it's the song of Moses that he says over the Israelites, and he says this about the Lord. He says, he is the rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. And I think when we look to that and we look to God as like the measurement and the bar of justice, like he is just, like there is nothing that we can say, like he is the standard of justice. And so when we look to him, I think that we can learn a lot about social justice and his heart for us to actually participate in justice with him as a church, as a communal body. And so rather than maybe a man-centered justice that comes from a place of resentment of the world and systems that are wrong and, people who have wealth and people who have power, like this idea of, we're acting out of like a resentment to God who acts out of like love and care for people. I think that we can actually flip the script on what justice is and how we're to participate in it as a church. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. That was very well put.
That's why she's here.
Right? Yeah, I could try and expand a little bit on it or look at it a little different. But I think you've done a really good job. I see a dichotomy between justice and what real justice is, I think is rooted in God's character.
Yeah.
And then the world has a concept of justice, which I think is rooted more in our human understanding of fairness and equality.
Yeah.
And, we love keeping score. And we feel like we're owed certain things when the balances get out of whack. And that is not the same as justice in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Are there wrongs? Are there injustices that need to be righted in our society? Yes, there are. But righting or correcting those justices only gets you so far in terms of the political mindset, the emotional investment that we have as a culture in certain issues. And sometimes I think we don't understand justice because we don't root it in the right source either.
Yeah.
If we root our sense of justice in our sense of fairness instead of that, that unshakable standard of justice that is God, we're going to end up in very different places. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful at all. I like the way Brittany put it, but
I like the way you put it, James. That was good.
There seems to be, you've both touched on a couple of things that I think are the struggle points for people, right? What's the issue at hand that needs to be dealt with, and is one piece of the puzzle, and then the other is, what have people already done to try to fix that, and how do I feel about those people or that movement or that concept or that idea? The amount of times that we run into people where we know that they really don't have a problem with Jesus, but they have a problem with Christians. Like, I mean, bridge that to a lot of social movements where it's like, well, I actually don't have a problem with equality. What I have is a problem with this person who talks like, they're very arrogant and they're very abrasive and they're very mean and they're very whatever. And so I'm having trouble getting over how this person is talking about this issue. And I think that's a hard thing that we need to look at too, because a lot of times those people, again, conflict vindication, warrior, Messiah, liberator, most of those people are very passionate about getting it done. And I don't know if you guys have been ever really passionate about anything, but sometimes the control of your emotion can flee for a moment as you're trying to figure out where that space is. I think a lot of times that we get caught in that vortex of not liking how people talk about something versus actually not needing to deal with the issue. And then there are some that just make us feel uncomfortable. There's a lot of people that don't know how to talk about, gender equality when it comes between, men and women, and some of the things that are just flat out built into how that's happened. There are people that don't know how to talk about race issues. And they're like, well, I'm not, the amount of people that have said, well, I'm not racist, without an underlying understanding of just some of the systems that are in place that aren't, maybe you didn't say something to somebody, but automatically put somebody behind. And you look at moments where Jesus identified those issues and dragged those people up, right? Whether it was, him walking past a group of children and the disciples going, you don't have time for this. And he goes, no. Like, these guys are just as important as you. Or whether he did it with women, or whether he did it with lepers, or whether he did it with whoever, every marginalized group that everybody else didn't have time for, Jesus had time for. And I wonder how much we get caught in the fact that we just get upset about how other people have talked about or dealt with it. And because people keep score, and because we live in a world, as we talked about 10 or 15 minutes ago, of comparison, so often people make a point that sounds like, well, you've got it so good, and so you should care because, or I need to knock down you a peg to lift you up a peg. And that's not how Jesus approached it either. Right?
Yeah.
There were moments where he went to the Pharisees and went, you guys are blind to what you're doing, so we need to bring you back to earth. But in almost every case, Jesus tried to rise the tide as opposed to push the boats down. And I just wonder if that's one of those things that it's a really uncomfortable conversation, because it almost always requires us to go to a place where we need to admit something about ourselves, where we need to learn something we didn't want to learn, or we didn't think that was a problem, or we need to apologize to somebody for something we did when we weren't trying to do it.
Yeah.
And these are major, major hurdles.
Yeah.
But when we look at Jesus, who taught about humility and a willingness to learn and look to him for wisdom, and every one of those feelings conflicts with everything Jesus taught us to do.
Yeah.
And it's just it just feels like it's a real struggle for a group of people who get together on a Sunday and go, well, I'm really trying to be better, who don't want to hear, but I still need to get better. I don't know.
No, That's so good. And I think like you hit it is like we're uncomfortable associating ourselves with injustice, right? It's like, okay, yeah, that's a big issue over there, but I'm over here. And like it's really only the social justice warriors that are going to go and like engage in that. But if we're like really truthful and reflective and like ask the Lord to reveal things in our lives, whether that's on a personal level or a structural institutional level that we're a part of, is like we're all a part of injustice. Like we're sinful people. We're fallen people, and we are participating in things that are not what God desires for his people. And so I think like that's the uncomfortable, probably one of the major uncomfortable parts of us engaging with this topic of justice is, yeah, the admittance that we are part of it.
Yeah. I have this idea in my head, and I don't know if it's going to pan out, so I'll try it. We talk a lot as a church about this idea of mission, vision, and method. And mission is a lot about who we are. That it defines our identity. Vision is sort of the how we're going to carry it out, and the method is what we're actually going to do. And I think when it comes to this discussion of justice, injustice, for us, a lot of the uncomfortable stuff is how do we understand justice and injustice and this concept of brokenness and sin that we live with in this world, and how do those things all fit together? And I think that, we talked about this a little bit in men's group a few weeks ago. We're working through Romans, and the behavior piece, the sin, the behavior is fits in that method category. It's the stuff we're actually doing. And from a biblical perspective of justice, I think, Jesus was not as concerned about the stuff that people were doing. He was concerned with transforming people's identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this old idea of root and fruit. If you get the root right, the fruit fixes itself, right? Like the fruit will change because the identity, the core, the root is what's been addressed. And again, we focus as human beings so much on the behavior, on the fruit, and for some parts of the argument, it's, well, we don't want to give up whatever the behavior or the fruit is, and or we value something differently than someone else does, and we get so hyper focused on that aspect of it in terms of how we understand justice. But God is calling us to relook at, to reevaluate, what is our core identity?
Yeah.
Who are we?
Yeah.
And what are we called to be? And then let the rest flow out of that. I don't know if that analogy worked, but
I think it's a lot easier to know what to do about something when you're secure in who you are, or where you belong. As you guys were talking here, I was just thinking of a couple things, and maybe we can find our way out of this conversation on these questions that we can leave with people. And in your generation and the kids that you're ministering to now are experiencing this in a different way than we are. But I think one of the fatiguing parts of this conversation for people is there always seems to be something new for us to feel bad about. And it seems like what's easy is to blame social media for that. When the reality is this stuff always existed.
Yeah.
Now it's just had a magnifying glass put on it.
Yeah.
And so, how do we filter these things? And what do we know what to pursue? Because there are people, I think, that feel like they're trying to take a step in one area, but then they get kicked in 3 or 4 other areas. And so then they feel bad, and then they don't want to do anything. When the reality is it's a person kicking them, which is a product of the problem. And if they really care about the problem, or they really care about the people behind it, that they're going to be able to look past it. From a social media, as a digital native, as opposed to us who are digital immigrants, how has your generation, and how are you teaching the ones that are coming up to filter the things like that? There's so much information. There's so much happening all the time. Yeah. how do we filter this through in a way that is healthy and in a way that acknowledges that there's a lot out there, but also admits that there's only so much one person can do at the same time?
Yeah.
How do you not give up on all of it while also being healthy through that? What do you think about that? And what are you telling teenagers as their frontal lobes are barely developed, but now all of a sudden they've got way more of the world's problems on their mind than any generation ever has before?
Yeah, no, that's so good. And I think a big thing is like going back to what Jesus said about it. Like he says in the book of Matthew that like the poor will always be among you. Like this is something that is like, there is no end to this issue until Jesus comes again. Like there will be no final level of justice. And so I think having that biblical understanding and then being like, okay, well, where does that leave us now? And how has Jesus instructed us to live now is just like, okay, we're going to do what we can, but like understanding that element of control of like, okay, like I want to see the end to this. Or even like as we're ministering to people, like, okay, sometimes we're just going to plant seeds and we're never going to see them to fruition. Or whatever that may be, like the end goal that we're reaching for, that justice, like that is never going to come in full until Jesus comes again. And so understanding that and kind of holding that tension in the middle of like, okay, but we still have a part to play. Like it says in the book of James that pure and genuine religion is caring for the orphans and for the widows. And so it's like, okay, we still have a role to play. Like God is still calling us to engage in these issues of injustice. And it might not always look big, and that's okay. Because I think like that's the thing with social media is like, okay, we see this and then we see like this massive action or we see this massive problem that, you know, feels too big for us to tackle. But if we actually just like start where we are in the context that we are in and just like genuinely come with hearts before God and say like, let me have eyes to see what you see, like break my heart for what breaks yours. And then together, like us as a church together, but also with the help of the Lord, like we can go into these spaces and, you know, do what, like be vessels of what God wants to do in them. And I think that can feel overwhelming for us, but and I'm sure we've all heard it, but it says like the quote that says like, do for one person what you wish you could do for a million. And I think that's so true. It's like, we have to start somewhere, and, you know, God has a heart for the lost, and, you know, like the shepherd that left the 99 for the one. And so it's like, okay, if we have the one in our context that we can reach, like that is so valuable to God, and it's so valuable to the church, and it's so valuable for that one person. And so understanding the broadness and the heaviness of injustice, and like, okay, this is like holding that tension, but also realizing that like, let's just do this on our level. Like, let's invite that kid to come sit with us at lunch. Like, let's call that person. Like, that can have an eternal impact, and is just equally as important.
I think it's interesting how we tie these two things together. Even as you said, you know, the poor, the orphans, they'll always live among us.
Mm-hmm.
We know that one of the ways that the early church got a name for itself was that there were certain cultures where if you gave birth to a girl instead of a boy, you walked that girl out to the edge of town or to a forest or to wherever, and you sort of gave it up.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, whatever happens, happens. And we know there were groups of early Christians that knew where those spots were and picked those kids up and brought them home. Mm-hmm. And not every kid made it, and that's a tragedy in its own. But here's a group that went, we're taking this extremely seriously. Mm-hmm. And the early church got one of its reputations as a group of people who cared for people that weren't themselves, which was very divergent from culture by what they did for the orphans and for those that were left behind. And so I think you've both brought the next step for somebody who's listening to this going, well, what do I do? James, you've brought the great question, which is, how do you view or how do you understand injustice? That's a great question for somebody to ask. They need to re-dig into that biblical view to see what God says and to really examine themselves to figure out whether they define injustice as the way that God sees it and explains it, or as when things seem unfair to me, because those two things aren't the same. Brittany brings up the next great step, which is just do something. Do one thing. I'm sure your heart's breaking for something. If it's breaking for 10 things, pick the one that it's breaking for the most, or the one you're most equipped for. When we start talking about what's next here for IPC, we know that when we brainstorm what should the church do, you get a whiteboard of 70 ideas, but we're really only going to be able to pull off 3 of them. But we can't feel bad about the 67 things that we weren't able to do. We look at the 3 and go, who do we have? And what has God equipped us for? And how many people do we have that can lean to this thing? And how do we just do something in our community? And so, great questions. How do we view this thing? And do we need to do a self-examination? And what's the one next step? Whether that's reading a book, or talking to somebody, or listening to a podcast. A lot of times the first step is education, which is tough because education almost always requires humility, which is a real pain in the butt. I don't know if it is for you, but it certainly is for me.
It always starts with the admission that you don't know everything.
Yeah. Right. Which I just... even though I know it's true, I'm still, for some reason, uncomfortable with it. Brittany, what you got going on this week? What are you excited about? What's coming up? James always forgets this question's coming up, so I'm giving it to you first so that he actually has an answer. But what are you excited about? What's going on? What's happening? Anything going on in your orbit?
Well, we've got Easter coming up, so we're planning all sorts of really fun Easter stuff. For our little ones, we're going to do some stuff like in our nursery age group, and then we've got like a church-wide Easter egg hunt for our youth is coming up. So we've got like a whole scale of Easter activities that has just been, going to be really fun to do some of the practical stuff, putting that all together.
Right.
Yeah.
James, is there anything happening in your world this week that's significant?
Nothing.
Nothing that's taking up your time and attention or energy?
No. Alpha's starting this week.
Oh, that little thing.
That little thing.
So good.
How are you feeling about Alpha?
I feel good.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of volunteers and probably about 2 or 3 tables worth of people coming, and we're going to eat really well, and we're going to have really good discussion, and that's what it's all about. So,
Awesome. That's great. Good. Well, thanks as always for hanging out. Brittany, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure you will be back many a time. And as we said to Fred a couple of weeks ago, don't be nervous or worry. There are literally tens of people listening to this. So you're all good. If you have any questions, make sure you email us at questions@thrive@ipc.com. Brittany, we've only had one question. We have almost 10 episodes.
What?
Nobody asks us anything.
Hey, you tens of listeners. Please send in questions. We would love to answer them.
Validate.
We actually just talked. That's so funny. We talked about it at youth last night, though, that like when we're learning about God, we're going to have questions. Like for our whole life, we're going to have questions, and it's okay. And like, let's talk about them. Let's be open about it. So it's cool.
To be clear, I don't doubt that people have questions. I just don't think they're coming to us for the answers.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe,
that is
maybe
fair, you tens of listeners.
If you're on more often.
No.
Well, this was a fun week. We'll see you or hear you or whatever you will again next time. But until then, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Brittany.
Bye.
Thanks, Brittany. Bye.